Good morning, everybody. My name is Adele Krach, and I am from Food Focus. And it gives us great pleasure to once again today have the Standard Dairy Agency as our sponsors for this very interesting topic that we're going to speak about today. As you know, the Dairy Standard Agency has got a set of webinars that they set up throughout the year, addressing very interesting topics, and today is no different. Today, we're going to speak about biosecurity on dairy farms. And in this webinar, we will look at the different legs in terms of how to prevent diseases from entering your farm, how do you prevent diseases from spreading on your farm, and how do you prevent diseases from spreading from your farm to others. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to your speaker today, Dr. Mark Chimes. Mark, it's so great to have you as part of the platform today to speak to all the delegates that's in on the webinar today about this interesting topic. Dr. Chimes was qualified as a veterinarian at Onderstepoort in 1986. He spent the first 30 years in private practice, of which 13 years was spent in the UK. So you know the funny weather and all the cold weather that we can have in the UK, and going into winter now, Mark, I'm sure of it, and the rainy seasons, you will be able to share some interesting information with the delegates. In 2013, he joined Delta Moon Laboratory as their Remulant Technical Advisor. Delta Moon offered laboratory testing for disease diagnosis as well as analytical tests for dairy industry. In addition, they also produced vaccines for production animals. In 2016, he joined the Dairy Standard Agency, where he has been auditing dairy farms to ensure compliance with quality and safety standards. These audits assist the farmers to also comply with animal welfare and biosecurity standards. Through the audits, Mark visits more than 150 dairy farms a year as a result, and he has an intimate knowledge of various dairy farm management systems. So as you can see, we've definitely got a speaker today that will be able to answer any questions that you've got in terms of biosecurity on your farm. Mark, we are looking forward to your presentation, and we can't wait to hear what you've got to share with us on this very interesting topic.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning on the second Monday this week. And looking at what Eskom is doing to us, it's going to be quite a blue Monday today. First of all, I'd just like to thank the Dairy Standard Agency also for the opportunity to be able to do the presentation and talk on a subject which is actually making all the headlines at this stage. Now, the title that says biosecurity is easier than you think, I specifically chose that to show that because on dairy farms, a lot of these things are already being implemented. So I'm not going to be telling you a lot of things that you don't already know. But what I want to try and convey is the principles of biosecurity. And to be able to comply with biosecurity, you actually need to know the disease processes and how diseases are transmitted. But that goes beyond the scope of this webinar. However, a lot of the rules and regulations that have been implemented and which you already comply with on your dairy farms address biosecurity issues. So the purpose of this webinar would be for you to try and see where there might be gaps in your biosecurity or where there's room for improvement, more than actually learning a lot of new things from this webinar. Now, I don't have to explain to you the effects of diseases and why biosecurity is important, because you've already seen it with the effect that foot and mouth disease has had on the exports of beef and mutton. It's wreaked havoc. The effect that bird flu had on a flourishing ostrich industry, it's brought them to their knees as well. And it's not just animals that we're talking about here. Biosecurity also has to be applied in plant production units. If you just think of the effect that black spot had on our citrus export markets. And on a more local basis, you've certainly, some of you have experienced quite severe losses with Cryptosporidium, red water, 3-day stiff sickness. So I don't have to tell you that everybody knows that diseases can and do and will get onto your farm. Now, biosecurity basically rests on 3 legs. Firstly, how do I prevent diseases from getting onto my farm? That's the first thing you want to do, is try and prevent from getting the disease in the first place. Then secondly, how do you prevent that disease from spreading on your farm once it is there? And then thirdly, how do you prevent it from spreading to your neighbors or to other human beings? Now, when I mention the word biosecurity, the first thing that people mention is footbaths and gates that are locking and access control, etc. Now, we tend to compare ourselves with pig and poultry farms because they have the ideal biosecurity systems. But the biosecurity that they can apply is at a very high level because they are contained units. There's no access for pests. It's very controlled very strictly in terms of who's allowed inside. And if you're running a 100 or a 500 hectare pasture-based farm, there are just so many access routes over the fences, through the gates, and what have you. We're not talking at this biosecurity at the same level here. And diseases can come in via birds, small rodents, predators and scavengers, pests, insects, parasites. Even the wind can blow dust in that can bring diseases onto the farm. So access control is only a very small part of biosecurity on a dairy farm, especially on a pasture-based farm. Now, I've tried to break down the control measures into the 3 legs of biosecurity, namely, how do you prevent diseases from coming onto your farm, how do you prevent them spreading, and how do you prevent the diseases from spreading from your farm to your neighbors. Unfortunately, it's not that simple to categorize them. There's a lot of overlap with some of these measures. So I'm starting with the overlapping measures, which will address all 3 aspects of biosecurity. Get my page down here. Now, the simplest, easiest, and cheapest way to prevent diseases from getting onto your farm, from spreading and from on your farm and to other farms, is to vaccinate by far. And a lot of diseases are completely preventable, virtually completely preventable through vaccination. And we're looking here at things like 3-day stiff sickness, lumpy skin, black quarter, anthrax, pulpy kidney in sheep, for instance. It's definitely worth the expense and the effort to vaccinate. Be careful, however, when you do the vaccinations. It's advisable to use a separate sterile needle for each animal. Not always practical and not always cost effective, but if you're perhaps struggling with a disease that is transmissible through blood, say such as enzootic bovine leukosis, you'd be better off to use a different needle for each animal. And don't become complacent just because the disease is not occurring or you haven't had the disease for some time. As a colleague of mine once mentioned, a farmer told him, "Oh, I've stopped vaccinating for 3-day stiff sickness because I don't see it anymore." And his answer to the guy was, "It's because you were vaccinating. That's why you're not seeing it. If you stop vaccinating, you're going to start seeing it again." We had a situation here in the garden route where we've not had brucellosis for 25, 30 years probably. And then suddenly one dairy farmer had an outbreak of brucellosis and he hadn't bought in any animals. It turns out that his neighbor had bought some calves from the Free State that he was fattening up for slaughter. And that was most likely how the brucellosis had been brought in. And this dairy farmer had not been vaccinating his heifers for years because, hey, he's not been seeing brucellosis and it was an expense. and it virtually ruined him. I mean, he's still trying to recover from that. So don't become complacent just because you don't see a disease. Parasite control, and you all know that ticks can convey diseases such as red water, anaplasmosis, heart water, etc. So make sure that you control the parasites. Internal parasites is not so much that they can transmit diseases, it's that they actually are the disease and it's transmitted from one animal to the other. So here we're talking about roundworms, liver fluke, tapeworms, etc. And obviously other parasites such as mange as well. Pest control, I don't have to tell you about pest control. Most farms, dairy farms certainly, have a pest control program. Flies, we know they can transmit disease, same with rodents. Be careful with crows and seagulls. They are scavengers and they can carry things like afterbirths or tissues from dead animals from one farm to the other. You've all seen what happens when a seagull has something in its mouth. All the other seagulls chase it and they frequently drop it. So they could be dropping it as he's flying over your farm. Dogs and cats can carry some diseases, so make sure that access by dogs and cats are controlled. And the main thing when it comes to pests is don't let them breed. Try and avoid the pests from building up huge volumes. You don't want them to build up numbers, so you want to try and catch them early on in the season. So control the areas where they breed. Do not let equipment or materials accumulate to provide shelter and breeding space for them. Now, these measures should prevent diseases from spreading on your farm. Rather, let's put it this way. These are the measures that are most likely going to prevent diseases from coming onto your farm. Access control, certainly, there is room for it. Controlling who gets onto your farm and where they go is important, and therefore gates are important. And fences. And the fences are to keep your animals in and to keep your neighbors' animals out. Veterinarians, your vet visits one farm after the other, frequently handling diseased animals. And if ever there's a potential source for transmitting diseases from one farm to the other, then your vet is one of them. Always ensure that he's wearing a clean overall and clean gumboots whenever he comes onto your farm. Visitors to your farm. On a dairy farm, fortunately, we've got a system where on nearly all the farms I come to, I would drive up to the parlor, I would park there, and I would go to the office. So there's already a designated area for visitors. What would be ideal is to fence it off and only allow visitors. It should be the only part of the farm they can get to. They must report to the office first, put up some signage so that they know where they're allowed to go, where they must park, and where there's unauthorized entrance. And do not allow them to roam over your farm unless they are providing specific services. For instance, the electrician, the vet, the guy coming to fix the pumps or the sprinkler system. The same applies to your milk lorry and also, to the feed delivery lorries. Most of them only really need access to the same parking area where all the other visitors go. And then try and keep your staff and vehicles out of the visitors area as much as possible. Transmission on wheels and spreading of diseases is not such a big problem as it's made out to be, but even so, it is a weakness in the system. People will have to come onto your farm and try and prevent any potential spread of disease from that area. When it comes to calf buyers, you want to take the calves to him and do not allow him near your calf area. Your calf area should be a quarantined area with controlled access. Nobody else should be allowed in there except the calf handlers, and they must disinfect their feet and their hands before they go in and also when they come out. On most of the farms that I visit, the farmers tend to have either have a camp near the gate, or they'll load the calves onto a trailer and take them to the gate when the calf buyer is on his way. And the calf buyer frequently doesn't even come onto the farm. They'll unload it next to the road onto his trailer and off he goes. The big danger with the calf buyers is that they frequently have calves from other farms already on their trailer that are urinating and defecating, and if this drops onto the farm, we all know the effects that cryptosporidium has had and is still having on some of the farms. In terms of quarantine, any new animal that is brought onto the farm needs to be quarantined for 30 days. That is the magic number. Within that 30 days, you'll have all the time to treat them for parasites, to vaccinate them, to test them, and also to see if they show any signs of any diseases that they might be carrying. If they're not showing signs within 30 days, you're probably safe. And then again, obviously, only buy animals that have already been tested for brucellosis and TB, and any other diseases that you might feel should be necessary to be tested, like trichomonas or campylobacter. The other thing that you also need to remember is any animal that has escaped, especially if your bull jumped the fence to go and visit the neighbor's cows, and he comes back, best to quarantine him before you allow him back into the herd, just in case he picked up something from the cows next door. If you have good communication with your neighbor, then you should have a good idea of any transmissible diseases that might be occurring on his farm, and whether you should be concerned or not. Likewise, your neighbor should also know if you have any transmissible diseases on your farm, so that should your bull break through, that it doesn't infect his cows. Excuse me. Also, moving animals from one farm to the other, or if you've rented land from your neighbor, or he's going to rent land from you, be very careful of restocking those areas or bringing those cows back into your herd. Best to quarantine those animals for a bit as well if you can, or to keep those pastures, let them lie fallow for a few weeks, and also to make sure that you know what the disease status is on the neighboring farm, once again, so you don't bring any diseases back from those areas. Animals going to shows and auctions. Generally, agricultural shows are not a high risk area because they tend to be the better farmers, and these tend to be the animals that are looked after even better, and they're vaccinated and wormed and treated, etc. But even so, when you bring them back from a show, quarantine them if you can. With auctions, definitely quarantine them, because the history of auction animals is always a bit dubious. If you borrow any equipment from your neighbor or lend any equipment to him, same thing, make sure it's clean before it's allowed back onto the pastures. Especially, and this is something we don't even think of, is that you frequently, if they're borrowing plows or tractor, or you've helped him with your tractor and it comes back with lots of mud and stuff, that you could be bringing in seeds from weeds and even toxic plants that could contaminate your pastures. And this is especially true when it comes to feed and bedding. Remember, not all the seeds are digested properly in a cow, so they pass these seeds onto the pastures, and the next thing you've got an infected pasture that you've spent a fortune to plant, and now you've got to try and get rid of these weeds again. In addition, there have been cases where, say, hard water has occurred in a herd in an area where hard water is not endemic, and when you start investigating, you find that it's probably ticks that came in through the hay. So be careful where you buy from. Use reputable suppliers. Quarantine areas, they need to be separate from the other animals on the farm. It must preferably be an area that's easy to clean and disinfect. So if you can afford it, a cement floor would be ideal, or keeping them in stables. It's not always possible. Most quarantine areas just tend to be a camp. But make sure that it's downwind from the prevailing wind direction on the farm. Watch your runoff of effluent, that it doesn't contaminate rivers or other water sources on the farm, and make sure that it runs away from your pastures. Also, the animals must not have any direct contact, so they must not be sharing food or water troughs. Keep your access routes away from the quarantine area so that the cows are not walking past it, so that they can't have nose-to-nose contact through fences. And obviously also pest and parasite control is important so that they don't transmit diseases from these quarantine cows to your cows. And the other thing is, if you need to handle the animals in quarantine, handle all your other animals first and then get to them last. You do not want to handle the quarantined animals and then go back and handle your calves. That's a recipe for disaster. As I've mentioned before, communicate with your neighbors. It's important that you know what's happening next door, and it's important for them to know what's happening on your farm in terms of infectious diseases. When it comes to also, it's important to know if they're keeping any game, especially blue wildebeest with bovine malignant catarrh or snotsiekte. And in northern Natal or northern KZN, where they get corridor disease from buffaloes. The other thing is also, if you're farming near or close to international borders, specifically Mozambique and Zimbabwe, there are diseases that are occurring in those countries and that sometimes move further south, diseases that we might have eradicated or that we haven't seen for years. So always keep an eye on what's happening on the other side of the border. The other thing is also test for diseases. You know you have to test for TB and brucellosis. Only buy animals that are certified, that come from TB and brucellosis-free farms. Otherwise, you'll be buying yourself huge problems. You can test for various other diseases, such as Johne's disease, bovine leukosis, liver fluke, depending on your circumstances, and discuss it with your vet. He'll be able to tell you whether you need to test and which diseases are important to test for. Consider having a post-mortem done on any animal that dies on the farm. I can't stress this enough. I am surprised sometimes where I'll see guys posting on Facebook, I've lost 10 cows already. Does anybody know what it could be? And you think 10 cows at what, 15,000 rands a cow? That's 150,000 bucks lost. He could have done a post-mortem on the first one. It would have cost him less than 2,000 rands, I would guess. And he would have he would have been able to solve his problem. I don't know, it's just not worth those losses. So get those post-mortems done and diagnose the problem early on and do something about it early on, because your losses could be a lot more than what you'll be saving from not using a vet. Now, the measures that are most likely to prevent diseases from spreading on your farm once the disease has got onto your farm. First thing is, keep your calves separate. They are the most susceptible group on the farm. Disinfect the navels immediately after birth, without fail. Okay? Calves generally die of three things: diarrhea, pneumonia, or infected navels. These are things that are avoidable. Well, certainly infected navels are avoidable. Give your calves their colostrum within the first 4 to 6 hours after birth. They reckon 10% of body weight. You're not going to be able to give all that in one go. You're going to have to split it in 2 feedings to be able to do that. They need 10% of their body weight in milk per day, minimum. Make sure the cows are vaccinated before calving so that they have very good antibody levels in their colostrum to pass the immunity on to their calves. If possible, use personnel that are dedicated to only handle the calves. In other words, on most farms, they'll have 1 or 2 ladies that manage the calves. They'll feed the calves, clean them, etc., and they'll do no other work on the farm except handle the calves. They must disinfect their hands and go through a footbath going in and also on the way out. Hygiene and disinfection of the feeding equipment is of utmost importance, because you'll be transmitting a disease from one calf to the other quite easily if you don't take care of that. And then strict access control. Remember, visitors to your farm, they all want to go and look at the calves and they want to pet them. Try and keep them away. Or if they do go in, they've got to go through the footpath and then tell them they're not allowed to touch the calves, just in case. And obviously pest control. Flies are a common problem around calf pens. Make sure that you prevent the buildup of flies as far as possible. This is something I see way too often. The milk that is supposed to be discarded from the mastitis cows and the animals that are having antibiotic treatments, and then it's fed to the calves for a cost-effective thing. Buy some pigs, give it to the pigs, all right? Except if you're actually a pig farmer, then I wouldn't suggest it. But if it's just a few pigs for slaughter, feed the stuff to them. The reason is mastitis milk is not a good quality milk. The constituents of mastitis milk, the protein and the fat content and the quality of protein is not the same. It's poor quality feed for your calf, apart from the fact that you could actually be passing diseases onto them. And milk containing antibiotics, not a good idea to feed it to your calves because you could be building up antibiotic resistance, and that is going to nail you in the future. Be very careful of doing that. Rather discard the milk and just get rid of it. In terms of staff rotation, your staff must realize that they will always start with the most susceptible group of animals first. That's your calves and your old animals. Then they will handle the healthy cows, and then the sick cows, and only then the quarantine animals, if there are any on the farm. You don't go and handle the sick cows and then go and work with your calves or go into the milk parlor. If possible, if your herd size and your staffing size and the budget allows for it, if you could have dedicated staff for each group, that would be great. So in other words, you'll have people that only do the milking, you'll have somebody who only treats the sick cows, and you'll have staff who only deal with the calves. That would be ideal. Sick animals need to be kept separate as well, preferably, once again, in an area that's easy to clean and disinfect. You handle them last. You also milk them last so that you can clean and disinfect the machine, and it has, so you can do it properly before you start milking the healthy cows. In this photo here, this is a full feed system, and they've actually got a separate milking area which is dedicated to just milking the colostrum cows, and then after that they will milk the sick cows, disinfect the machines, and this area is only used for those. So these animals don't go into the milk parlor at all. If you have the budget and the space and the herd size to justify it, it's very nice to have. Hazardous waste, specifically clinical waste, medical waste. If the vet has been on the farm and there's a lot of blood-covered swabs and or pus or whatever, make sure that you get rid of those materials properly. Bury it or burn it. Don't let it lie out in the open, and preferably let him take it away with him. Staff hygiene. I'm going to rush through this part a bit because this is stuff that all of you are doing and that you know already. They must wash their hands, they must wear the protective clothing, no smoking, eating or drinking, and that is because you don't want them touching their faces and perhaps picking up a disease on your farm. Something that is overlooked in terms of biosecurity that tends to work on biosecurity in the background is having a sickness agreement, which is a document you draw up yourself that just states that that every staff member must sign, and it just states that I hereby acknowledge that if I've been sick, I must report it before I go into the milk parlor, especially if I've been coughing, had diarrhea, or if I have sores on my hands. And the coughing is for TB, diarrhea is for salmonella, and if they have sores or cuts on their hands, they have to wear gloves or have some waterproof plasters applied. Also, ideally, the staff should be taken for medical health checks once a year to be certified that it's safe for them to work in a food-producing environment. And then training. Training is important. Do they know what your biosecurity protocol is and why you've got one? Do they understand the hygiene protocol? Do you have a treatment protocol for common diseases? Can they spot and diagnose, or at least pick up that the animals are sick? Cleaning and disinfection protocols. And toilets. People, please. Most toilets on most farms are quite appalling. A toilet must have a hand basin, toilet paper, disinfectant soap, as well as paper towels for them to dry their hands. If people have been to the toilet, they need to wash their hands before they go and handle any animal. And if these facilities are not available at the toilet, then unfortunately this procedure will frequently be skipped. Hygiene equipment must be made of metal or plastic. Wood is not allowed because it is porous and therefore very difficult to disinfect and clean. And they must be stored correctly so that they can stay clean. Ideally, they should be color-coded so that you use them in the specific areas so that they know, let's say the white brushes are specifically for the milk tanks, and the blue brushes are for the milking machine, and the red brushes are only for the floor, etc. So they don't end up using the floor brushes on the milk tanks. Cleaning schedules in writing. Wash water temperature is important to check because most farms have hard water. The elements don't last. You end up with a lot of cold water, and it might take a few days sometimes before anybody notices that the element is gone. And then the soap is not being functioning properly. It's pointless having SABS approved soaps and disinfectants if they're not being used properly. And then obviously drain and clean the moisture trap, service your machines, change the liners frequently, etc. In terms of hygiene, you want to milk clean and dry teats. Do not wash the udders unless it is absolutely necessary if they're full of mud. And even then, if you wash the udders, then dry the teats using a paper towel, and you use a different paper towel for each cow. You don't use the same paper towel, and cloth towels are definitely out because the dirt and disease just sticks to it and you're carrying it from one cow to the other. Ideally, you'd want to strip test every cow before milking to check anybody that might have mastitis so that you know which clusters to give a little bit extra attention to after milking in terms of disinfection. However, I know that can be a controversial topic because some farmers don't want their people to handle the teats, and on some farms they just don't strip at all, but then they have conductivity meters. But in any case, wash and disinfect or backwash the clusters, and disinfect, and also disinfect hands in between cows. Slurry management, same thing. Don't contaminate your water surfaces. Keep it out of the pastures. Waste storage and disposal. Make sure that these areas are kept clean, that the bins must have tight-fitting lids to prevent flies and vermin from getting in there, especially scavenging birds and carrying it all over the farm. Afterbirths, make sure that they're picked up and removed, and that they're buried or discarded off properly so that flies and vermin can't get to it. Try and keep your cows out of flay areas and dams because liver fluke is a huge problem there, and also they defecate and urinate in the water and contaminate it. It might cause E. coli problems. Also be careful of feeding equipment such as wheelbarrows and buckets. Preferably use dedicated ones for separate areas, especially quarantine areas and calf areas. You don't want to use the same buckets and wheelbarrows from the quarantine or the sick cows and then use them on the calves as well. This photo here, this is a little chap that I saw on one of my audits. Fortunately, he was being kept outside due to having good screens over the open areas. But certainly on feed, be careful. Do not feed your cows moldy feed. Moldy feed produces toxins called mycotoxins that can be deadly for the cows. And if it doesn't kill them, it will certainly make them sick. And failing that, it will most definitely affect your milk production. Also, these mycotoxins are passed through the milk and is dangerous for humans as well. Your milk buyer will be testing for it on occasion to make sure that you your levels are within acceptable levels. And also, obviously, it's a huge source of rodents. That's what draws them, tends to be the feed. Make sure that you keep them out of your feed stores. Rats urinate and defecate wherever they run, and they can contaminate your feed with diseases, specifically things, something like leptospira. The same applies to your feed bunks and water troughs. Make sure that they're clean, that the animals can't urinate and defecate in them. This photo on the right here, this was on a farm as well. This is a dry afterbirth. This wasn't the only one. In this case, they seem to have just left it wherever the cows were calving. I would certainly not recommend that. This is a farm I visited just before the evening milking, so it had been cleaned after the morning milking. That is dry cow dung stuck on there, and that's definitely not just from the morning milking. That must be at least a week's worth. Terrible cleaning practices here. These are the clusters. As you can see, they're already plugged in. They were washed. This is just before the evening milking, and they're supposed to be cleaned. Dogs and cats. Cats are very good at keeping the mice under control, but they can also carry diseases, and they sometimes bury their feces in the bedding. So be careful that they don't transmit specifically tapeworms. Same goes for dogs in terms of tapeworms. They can also transmit neospora, which causes abortion in cattle, and in extreme cases also rabies. Make sure that your laborers' dogs especially are vaccinated and that they are wormed. Vaccinate them against rabies. And your own dog as well, try and keep them off the pastures so that they don't defecate on the pastures. In terms of water, it's all logic once again. Is the water clean? Just because cows will drink from dams and rivers doesn't mean they like dirty water. It's just if they're too thirsty, and they will drink whatever they need to. Once again, are the animals prevented from defecating in the water troughs? If you do treat your water with chlorine, test it once a week with one of these swimming pool dipsticks, just to check that your chlorine levels are actually at a level that's effective to control any diseases in there. Water sources such as tanks and reservoirs need to be covered to prevent contamination by birds and vermin. Test your water for their bacterial levels twice a year, specifically E. coli, coliforms, which will indicate fecal contamination. All right, and make sure that you address any stagnant water areas and water leaks, because those wet areas is an absolute breeding ground for pests. Just to show you what is achievable, the farm on the right, that's also a dairy farm. I didn't take a photo of the actual parlor, just in case somebody might recognize the farm. This is also a farm I happened to visit in the Free State, nogal, which is not really a dairy area. And this belongs to this lady here, a black lady. She and her son runs it. It is the cleanest, most sterile parlor I have ever seen in my life. Her people even wear hair nets when they milk the cows. I mean, this is a dream setup. This is how it should be. Very, very impressive. So it just shows it can be done. How do I prevent diseases from spreading from my farm to the other farms next door? By doing everything I've already mentioned. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but it basically, all the things that we've mentioned. Your fences will prevent your animals from getting onto their farm. By vaccinating, you're preventing diseases. Cleaning equipment, if you lend it to your neighbor or give it back, etc. Now, just in closing, a short word on zoonosis. Zoonosis is a disease that's transmitted from humans to animals or from animals to humans. And to prevent it, same thing, your people wear protective clothing. You disinfect between animals, the people disinfect their hands, etc. They wash their hands after working with the animals. You test for TB and brucellosis, both diseases that are transmissible to humans. We vaccinate against some diseases that are transmissible to humans, specifically Rift Valley fever, which we expect to be rearing its head shortly with all the rain and the warm summer that we've had. And then just a specific word on rabies. What I wanted to show you here is if you are farming in a high-risk area such as KZN and the Eastern Cape, if you look on this list here, bovine, that's cattle, 3 cases in cattle and 2 cases in goats. This is only in the first 3, we're not even through the 4th month of the year yet. It does occur. There was 1 human fatality already this year in KZN. In the Eastern Cape, we already had 2 human fatalities this year, 7 cases in cattle, 2 cases in goats, 1 in a sheep, even 1 in a horse. Now, in herbivores, rabies is basically a dead-end disease, since these animals, if they get rabies, they don't run around biting people and animals. But what does happen, and the danger here is you'll come to your pasture in the morning, you'll see a cow lying there, drooling at the mouth, you'll think there's something stuck in its throat, you'll get it in the crush, whip its tongue out, stick your hand down its throat to see if there's any blockage. And in the process, you get cuts and scrapes on your hand, and the saliva gets into your bloodstream, into the nerves, and next thing, you're one of the human cases of rabies. Be very careful. If you're in a high-risk area, you can vaccinate against it. It's dirt cheap. And by all means, consider adding it to your list, and make sure that all the dogs and cats on your farm are vaccinated for rabies. Carnivores are by far the biggest spread of rabies, jackals especially, and dogs. So, in conclusion, as I said at the beginning, several of the measures are already being implemented on your farm. Most of them are common sense, they're cheap, and they're easy to implement. If you're not implementing these things, start with the easy ones first and the cheap ones, and then you can move on to the more advanced and complicated measures as your system allows for it. Compile a basic biosecurity checklist based on the points that I've mentioned. Okay? Sit down with your veterinarian once a year to determine where your biggest risks are and what may have changed. And assess whether your measures are effective and adapt as needed. And basically, if you get the basics right, the rest will follow quite easily. So biosecurity on a dairy farm is definitely easier than you think, since you're already implementing a lot of these measures. And just focus on the 3 legs, the basic principles of biosecurity, namely that you can prevent diseases from getting onto your farm. And if they do get onto your farm, you can prevent them from spreading. And if there's an outbreak on your farm, you can also prevent these diseases from spreading from your farm to other farms or even to people. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate the very practical way that you've presented this to us. And currently, we've got only 1 question on the floor. And I would really like to ask the audience if there's any questions, please be so kind to put your question in the question bar so that we can ask Mark. As you can see by Mark's presentation, he says your first port of call is to communicate to your veterinarian. So for having one with us right now, you can save those costs. We've got the veterinarian on call. So please make sure. Okay, so Mark, I've got 1 question thus far, and the question is from Ruan de Villiers, and he says, what is the best design for calf houses? I think seeing out of your presentation how important it is in terms of the biosecurity and how many times you mentioned the calves and the impact they can have. Do you have an answer for Ruan on this question?
Yeah, this is it's not such a simple answer. The first problem is that what is best in terms of biosecurity might actually raise animal welfare issues. So you want your calves to socialize from a young age, but in terms of animal welfare, but you also want to isolate them to prevent diseases from spreading. Then you also have the SANS regulations with which you need to comply, which says that there should be bedding. They don't like slatted floors, whereas from a biosecurity point of view, slatted floors are just so much easier because all the feces and dung will drop through, and especially if it's raised so that you can clean underneath the calf cages. And there must be space for the calf to lie down and turn around without touching sides, and they must be able to at least see and hear other calves. In an ideal world, you'll have calf pens that are large enough for the calves to turn around without touching the sides, and they should be about at least half a meter away from the next calf hutch so that you don't have nose-to-nose contact. Because if one calf on the one end of the calf house gets some other illness and they have contact, it'll pass through all of them through to the other side of the calf house. Obviously shade, there must be place for food and water, and they must be sheltered. Having said all this, I've seen systems where the calves are kept separately, individually, in raised calf hutches, on slatted floors, with cages that are even too small for them to turn around. And I've been to farms where the calves are turned out into little camps where there's 10 or 20 of them kept, where they're kept in groups of 10 or 20, with virtually no shelter. And I've not seen any difference in terms of results. The ones in camps, those farmers claim that their calves are much stronger because they're exposed to the elements from a young age, etc. And they move obviously from one camp to the next. So the next batch goes into a separate camp. So it's an all-in, all-out system. And then I'll speak to another farmer and say, oh, he's had problems, but since he's got calf hutches, he solved this problem. I think it's a case of horses for courses, and whatever your management system is, whatever best suits your farming technique, your style.
Thanks, Mark. That's quite a clear answer. Mark, I've got a question. In terms of auctions, I mean, with your presentation, it was very clear in terms of the farmer himself, you know, that needs to follow all these protocols and everything that you've mentioned. But in terms of auctions, are they doing something specifically in terms of biosecurity? And is there any regulations or standards or laws applicable just on people that has, you know, auctions?
Adele, yes. We know we've got, I think, the Bloemfontein shows coming up, and then we've got NAMPO coming up, which are in the Free State, where, you know, we've had some foot and mouth cases. It seems that these cases are contained. There's not been any reports of any new outbreaks yet. But as far as shows go, it tends to be your better quality farmer, and these animals are also better looked after. So the chances of them actually taking a disease to the show is quite slim. So these are not high risk or as risky as, for instance, an auction would be. Having said that, there are control measures in place. For the shows, they have specific protocols that these people have to follow, the farmers, where they have to inspect their animals every day, quarantine the animals, and inspect them every day for the preceding 28 days before the show, so that they know they're not bringing foot and mouth disease with them. And then there's all sorts of forms they have to sign to confirm that they don't have a problem. When they take the animals back, they must quarantine them as well before allowing them back into the herd. So yes, there are control measures. It doesn't seem to be a huge problem yet. The biggest problem with foot and mouth is animals in close proximity, and that's where animals were brought illegally from Limpopo from the foot and mouth controlled area to the Northwest Province and the Free State, and these animals then infected animals in which they were in close contact. Generally, foot and mouth won't spread through the air that far.
Okay, and I'm going to ask just as a general question for myself. You know, I've got a friend that's got a auction, and I've visited his auction once or twice, and specifically where you were speaking about the calves and things like that, you know, where they allow the kids to go to this area and touch them and things like that. So it would rather be better for people that has got auctions to also apply the type of rules that you've indicated, you know, even if it's a normal farm. Am I right if I say that?
Yeah, I think it probably applies more to an auction than a farm. On a farm, the people that pet the animals there aren't really a big risk, because unless they're coming from another farm,
Yes.
because they're just touching one calf and going to the other one. And if it's your own calves and there's no disease problem, then they're not transmitting anything. At an auction, now they're walking around and they're touching animals from different owners, and they're stroking all of them. They're going from one to the other. So if one of them does have a disease, they could be transmitting it from one calf to the other that way. So I would say certainly try and keep people away from touching and handling animals. You don't want the animals to mix, and therefore you don't want the people to do the mixing for them either.
Yes, yeah. Ina, I see you, I don't know if you want to ask a question. I can see that you raised your hand. Is there a question from your side, Una? Can you just type it in, or if you want to ask the question, just let me know before I'm going to sign off if there's no further questions. Or otherwise, you know, what you can also do is you can email the question to us and we will then try to get an answer for you. Oh, there it comes. Is there a recording made? Oh, yes. I'm going to get to that. So if there's no more questions from the floor, Mark, I want to say on behalf of Dairy Standards Agency, thank you very much for presenting this to us in the very practical form that you did and way that you did. We really appreciate that. And yes, everybody, as you know, after each webinar, the webinar recording is available on our website. So we currently, if you would go onto the Food Focus website and you will see the webinars, you will have a drop down there that would provide you with the recording. So you are welcome to share this recording, and should there be any questions specifically that you would like to be answered, you can email us directly and we will make sure to get these questions through to the Dairy Standards Agency and in that way get answers from them. Mark, thank you very, very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And to everybody in the audience, thank you for your time. Hope that you got the answers that you were looking for, and may you all have a blessed day. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for signing in and attending. I know it's a lot of points that were raised in a very short space of time, but I hope it just showed you the basic principles that apply to biosecurity, and that it gives you food for thought. Thank you very much.